International Studies. My name is Daniel Sargent, and I am co-director of the Institute. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon for a very special panel on our colleague George Breslauer's new book, The Rise and Demise of World Communism. I think George was a little apprehensive about the long and loquacious introduction that he anticipated I would give, and he asked me to give a brief introduction in order to preserve time for the more interesting discussion that is to follow. So, out of respect for George's preferences, I will do just that. So let me just present to you George Breslauer, political scientist and Sovietologist of enormous renown. In addition to his scholarly work, George has also served this university as Provost, which for the uninitiated means CEO. He's also a longstanding sort of friend and supporter of the Institute of International Studies. That I did want to mention. After George has presented on his new book, we will have comments from two colleagues of mine from the History Department, Engman and John Connelly. Puck is a specialist in the history of modern China, John a specialist in the history of modern Eastern Europe. That, I think, tells you all that you need to know. So with that abbreviated introduction, let me turn the conversation over to George.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you for coming out for this talk. I appreciate the opportunity. I thought I'd start by saying a few things about craftsmanship, about writing this book, before I get into the substance of the book. First of all, I draw your attention to the cover, which I had no role in designing, but eagerly approved once I saw it. Oxford University Press came up with this, and I thought it was spectacular. You see the rise in red and the demise in gray, and it stands out in bookstores on their stands, by the way. Also nice. Another thing about craftsmanship is I didn't want to write an encyclopedic book. I didn't want to write a reference work on everything you need to know about 16 communist regimes, or it would have been twice as long. I wanted to write a book that was about this length, 300, 320 pages, that would be digestible. And that meant that I had to leave a lot of things out. So I didn't go into detail about those communist regimes that didn't call themselves communist parties. I didn't go into detail about leaders' biographies at all. I didn't go into the details of the policy-making process in these regimes, except when it seemed unavoidable. I didn't go into details about a lot of the satellite regimes in Eastern Europe, except when these or their societies were in defiance of Moscow. And then I felt I had to, and ought to. I avoided extensive footnoting and a lengthy bibliography, and I avoided trying to adjudicate the innumerable disputes in the field, or in the fields, about this or that matter with respect to this or that regime. Instead, what I tried to do was to drive through several themes, starting with Karl Marx and ending with Xi Jinping. So I was covering a lot of landscape, both geographically and over time. One thing from a craftsmanship standpoint I want to draw your attention to if you aspire to write a book, and that is on page 51, I made a real blooper. I referred to the Central Powers during World War I as the Axis powers, referred to it 3 times. And what's fascinating about that, and this is more than just self-flagellation. 9 readers, including myself, read through this manuscript, and I read through it 5 times as I was rewriting it 5 times, and thinking so much about the themes that I wasn't into fact-checking, and I just missed it. And 8 other people who read the entire manuscript missed it too. And it was only the editor of Oxford University Press, about 3 months after it had been published, was happening to read a manuscript on World War I, and something clicked. And he wrote to me and he said, on page 51, you said Axis powers 3 times, George. And I said, well, David, correct it. And so he said they try to correct it in the Kindle version, but it would take a while before they could correct it in the paper version. There's an error of omission elsewhere also, where in parentheses I listed the members of the Warsaw Pact and neglected to include Czechoslovakia for some reason. I only noticed that on my own later on when I was using the book for other purposes. So I guess the lesson of that is it's hard to do an ambitious book and have no blooper left in it. But certainly if I have another book in me, I'm going to be more attentive to that, perhaps get somebody just to do a complete fact check if they can. Well, let me say something about what this book is and is not. This is an attempt at synthesis. It's not original research. My first publication was in the field of comparative communism. It came out in 1970, and it was a period when we couldn't anticipate what was going to be going on in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, or China, or Vietnam for that matter. And so at that time, it was more of just an exercise in what's the difference between Chinese communism and Soviet communism. And what's the difference between Stalinism and post-Stalinism? And that's basically what those books of the 1960s in the comparative communism area were about. But now, of course, we can look back at the rise and demise of European communism, as well as Mongolia, and also observe decades of the evolution of the remaining communist regimes. This book tries to do a number of things. It tries to categorize types of communist regimes over time and across space. It's a macro-political analysis of the origins and evolution of communist regimes. Its focus is unabashedly top-down. There's been tremendous amount of work on social history and cultural history of these countries. But my take when looking back on the phenomenon, how it evolved over time, my take was really that these regimes had a combination of ideology and organization and coercive power and the ability to quickly eliminate organized political opposition, that you have to start from a top-down perspective, and you can then go bottom-up when you're looking at cases of defiance of the regime that take off, even if they don't ultimately succeed necessarily. So I do begin with a top-down perspective and a macro-political analysis. And another feature of this book is that I combine a focus on state-society relations within communist regimes with a focus on relations among communist regimes and a focus on their relations with capitalist, imperialist powers. And so it's the interaction of the internal and the external, and it's the interaction of the internal and the varieties of external relations, inter-communist within the World Communist Movement and between the World Communist Movement and capitalist regimes, and how these relationships affected the evolution of these regimes. So let me say first what this presentation will not deal with. I'm not going to go into the origins. You have to be very selective when you're doing a book presentation and deciding not to make it 3 hours long. I'm not going to deal with the origins of these communist parties and the conditions that facilitated their coming to power. I'm not going to deal with my chapters on counterfactuals. Was Stalinism a logical continuation of Leninism? Was the Cold War avoidable? Could détente of the 1970s have succeeded? I'm not going to deal with the chapters evaluating the communist experience, whether it's a chapter on whether Stalinism was a rational, quote, rational strategy of modernization, or whether Maoism was on balance a plus or a minus, or whether the communist experience in general was on balance an achievement or a tragedy. There are books on that, and I deal with it in this book in 3 or 4 chapters, but I'm not going to get into that today. I'm not going to get into the chapters on the prospects for the durability of communist regimes that remain after the collapse of European communism. Instead, what I'm going to do is focus on the categorization and the explanation exercises that are the thrusts of this book. The kind of scholar that I am is the type that is always looking for patterns, then seeking to conceptualize categorizing those patterns, and then seeking to explain why those patterns emerged and evolved. So one major theme is about the evolution of communist regimes and inter-communist relations. That is to say, from uniformity to difference in state-society relations, and from monolithism to discretion, from central command to political horse trading within the world communist movement. Uniformity. The early stages of communist rule after the victory are remarkably similar. It's consolidation of power by a revolutionary elite, the extolling of revolutionary violence against varieties of class enemies, a Moscow-centric bloc, a mission abroad of anti-imperialism, a commitment to build socialism, because none of them came to power in countries that had the prerequisites of socialism that Marx had stipulated, advanced capitalism. And the model for building socialism was the Stalinist model, because it was the only model available after 1928. No new communist regimes came to power until 1944-45. And so, looking back on the Stalinist script for building socialism became not only an orientation, but also a way of demonstrating your ideological credentials. Now, the Stalinist script for building socialism is elaborate, and it's implemented to varying degrees across these countries. But the thrust in almost all the cases is nationalization of large-scale private property, collectivization of agriculture, though Poland held off on that, a command economy, that is to say ambitious economic developmental goals and heroic storming to achieve them, vast programs for literacy and training of new generations of technical specialists, social welfare measures to maintain the health of the workforce, party-state hierarchies, Communist Party plus secret police at all levels, suppression of autonomous political organization, censorship, deference to Moscow as leader of the bloc, regime maintenance plus anti-imperialist struggle as your mission in foreign relations, and one-man leadership. Now, all this script for building socialism was devised long before these communist regimes, besides Mongolia, had come to power or been put in power. And so thereafter, there were two pathways for following this script. One I call coerced emulation of the model, and that was the vassal regimes of Eastern Europe, even if their chosen leaders who came to power didn't feel coerced about it because they believed in it. Nonetheless, they didn't have the choice of opting out. And then there was voluntary emulation, and other countries that came to power on their own or were more distant from the Soviet Union or were not under its control had the option of opting out but chose not to. And so to one degree or another, they followed the only script in town. And all of them professed to be building socialism. Now, Stalin dies in March of 1953. By the middle of 1952, we sometimes refer to the situation as high Stalinism. Basically, it was frozen in place. Terroristic despotism, a war economy, consumer austerity, monolithic bloc unity, or demand from Moscow of this, and a confrontational posture toward imperialism. Not necessarily eager to go to war with imperialism, but certainly to stand ready to confront it if imposed. Now, the drive from uniformity to difference after Stalin's death, it seems to me, is triggered by the fact that his successors broke with this script of high Stalinism of 1952. His successors viewed it basically as unsustainable. Khrushchev's anti-Stalin campaign, the end of mass terror, greater focus on the consumer, the loosening of discipline within the bloc, Khrushchev going to make nice with Tito and the like, East-West détente in hopes of avoiding nuclear war. So what this turn did was to open the spigot for a variety of regime types and a variety of societal responses within communist states, and that's why I call this the drive to difference. Let me present my categorization of three types of regimes after de-Stalinization and beyond. One I call Stalinism, basically despotism maintained. And that was the case, even now in the 1950s after de-Stalinization, despotism maintained marks the regimes of North Korea, Albania, and Mao's China. In fact, there's a delicious quote from Mao after Khrushchev had denounced the personality cult, in which he says, no, personality cults are intolerable unless they're merited. So a second variant after de-Stalinization was what I call bureaucratic Leninism. That is to say, top-down management of the economy and of the society without mass terror, plus allowing officialdom to consolidate its privileges, and no marketization of the economy. Yes, you have private plots, but we're talking about market coordination as the driving force of the economy. And that was not a characteristic of bureaucratic Leninism. I would call the Soviet Union from 65 to 85 bureaucratic Leninism. The vassal regimes in Eastern Europe, for the most part, I'd also call bureaucratic Leninism, even though Ceausescu went off on his own patriarchal path. And the Kadar regime introduced a small degree of marketization. And Cuba since the 1970s, I would call bureaucratic Leninism. And then the third variant is market Leninism, that is to say marketization of the economy, which is not to say the elimination of all state enterprise, but marketization of the economy, its opening to the capitalist international market combined with Communist Party monopoly, or the maintenance of Communist Party monopoly. And I distinguish between narrow scope and broad scope marketization. Narrow scope marketization would be Yugoslavia under Tito. Some people might argue, it would be even a narrower scope than Yugoslavia, but you might say Kadar's Hungary evolved into a very narrow scope marketization. And then there's broad scope marketization, which marks Deng's China and his successors China, Vietnam, and Laos. Now, these deals being offered by these regimes were not accepted by all of their societies in terms of the reactions, the behavioral reactions. You get worker rebellions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria in 1953, in Poland in 1970 and 76. You get anti-communist revolutions in Hungary in 1956, which was violent, in Poland in 1980-81 under Solidarity, which was not violent, and in Eastern Europe 1989 to 92, which, with the exception of Romania, were also nonviolent revolutions. But then you had a third variant, which was communist democratization from within the Communist Party. And that was Czechoslovakia of 1968, because that was driven from within the party. And the USSR, driven by Gorbachev's reforms from 1986 to 1991. Now, there were also varieties of responses to loosened bloc discipline in the decades after Stalin. Discretion over monolithism is the way I would put it. Some engaged in unilateral withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. That was Hungary in 1956, and that was crushed. And then there was schism within the world communist movement. That was China and Albania and leading Asian non-ruling communist parties. So I have to say this book does not deal in any depth at all with non-ruling communist parties. The foot in several camps is what I call a third variant, either the East-West camp or the Soviet-Chinese camp. So Tito's Yugoslavia tried to bridge the East-West plus the non-aligned movement plus the World Communist Movement, rather skillfully, I must say. Czechoslovakia in 1968, I think they did not talk about withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact because they learned the lesson of 1956. But I think if they had been allowed to develop, they probably would have ended up drifting westward. So I'll put that foot in several camps, even though the foot was stomped on before it could make a big step. Euro-communism in general was an intellectual effort to think about bridging the divides between East and West. Romania under Ceausescu very deftly carved out areas of autonomy vis-a-vis Moscow's foreign policy that allowed it to play Moscow and Beijing off against each other and to maintain a greater autonomy in foreign relations even with the West than many of the other East European regimes. North Vietnam was trying to be nice with both the Soviet Union and China because it needed both of them, obviously. And Cuba, which was dependent upon external assistance given the U.S. embargo and the constant threat of U.S. invasion or assassination. And then a fourth variant was something that, is sort of striking when you think about it. Ultimately, what we get is warfare among communist states. Warfare between China and the USSR in 1968-69, a series of border skirmishes where hundreds died. Hundreds of your soldiers died. It didn't escalate, but it might have. Then there was Vietnam overthrowing the Khmer Rouge regime in Kampuchea, formerly Cambodia. And then there was China's seeking to punish Vietnam for having overthrown the Khmer regime earlier that year in December of 1979. Now, what are the downstream consequences of this drive to difference in both domestic and international affairs? Well, 11 communist states of the 16 that I call communist in this book have ceased to exist. The USSR, the Mongolian People's Republic, all 8 East European communist states, including Albania and Yugoslavia, neither of whom was in the Soviet camp or a member of the Warsaw Pact at the end. Khmer Rouge's Kampuchea has ceased to exist. Interestingly, all but the last of these are due to internal revolutions. The last, Khmer Rouge, are product of displacement by the Vietnamese army. 5 communist states of the original 16 continue to exist, and they're notable to me for their different variants. You have market Leninism in the PRC, Vietnam and Laos. You have bureaucratic Leninism in Cuba, and you have Stalinist despotism in North Korea. And there's no longer a world communist movement. The remaining regimes, these 5 remaining regimes, are driven by pragmatic definitions of their national interests. There's not a coordinated alliance here, tacit or otherwise, among states committed to anti-imperialist struggle. They follow balance of power politics. They try to figure out what they can and cannot get away with, but they are not part of an international subsystem of communist states. There can be hostilities among them, as there are. There can be affinities, but there's not a common interest. Each pursues a distinct foreign policy. So there's no longer a world communist movement. And that gets me back to the title of the book, The Rise and Demise of World Communism, because when I first told people about my new book that's going to be coming out, and they said, really, what's it called? And I said, The Rise and Demise of World Communism. Invariably, there's a pregnant pause followed by, what about China? And the point here is there's no longer a world communist movement, hence world communism, rather than the rise and fall of communism. So let me turn now from categorization to explanation. Why the drive to difference in the post-Stalin era? I personally believe that it would not have occurred had Stalin lived on. He died about the age of 73, I think it was, and suppose he had lived as long as Mao did. He would have kept the lid on, I believe. But given his death and the Soviet regime seeking to move beyond his high Stalinist approach, differentiation of response, it seems to me, was inevitable. But that said, the types of differentiation that we've witnessed are driven by a variety of factors. And let me list some of those factors grouped according to the outcomes they might help to explain. So one outcome is, why does Moscow's delegitimation of Stalinism lead to diverse regime and societal responses? Well, at the level of the elites, regime, for one thing, there was limited, if any, practical guidance from the ideological heritage. No clear script for going beyond building the foundations of socialism. Stalin provided a script that Marx would not have provided himself, and perhaps Lenin would not have either, but that is a moot point at this point. But he provided the script for building the foundations of socialism, that long list that I indicated before. But nobody provided a script for what you do after that. And so there was discretion, therefore, to innovate ideologically, doctrinally. And Moscow was not necessarily going to be dictating a new script that everybody was expected to follow, except in terms of the parameters. You don't allow the overthrow of the communist regime. You don't allow autonomous political organization, and so on. Another factor that influenced the elites, I think, was the timing of revolutions. Most other communist regimes came to power during Stalin's last years. So they had not been in power very long when he kicked the bucket. And that led to varied elite interest in de-Stalinization and in ending their own personality cults, because Stalin may have died, but most of the others had not. At the societal level, varieties of defiance, I think, were driven by, on the one hand, a perception of opportunity. When you view the elite as unified, eager to crush any opposition, and preventing you from either communicating or coordinating, it's very tough to build a societal opposition in defiance of wherever you're going with your regime in the post-Stalin era. But there was a perception of opportunity because of elite disorganization, division, or demoralization in Moscow and at home. And what that did was to provide opportunities for collective action. Collective action requires the ability to communicate and coordinate. And when you communicate and coordinate and mutually perceive that the elite is divided or demoralized, you think you have an opportunity. And that's precisely what happened in the post-Stalin era. But then there was also disaffection and alienation. People would not be defying if they were happy with what the deal was. And here I think an important consideration is the clash between the rhetorical ideals that the regimes continue to espouse and the promises they continue to make versus the realities. And that led to varying types and degrees of disaffection, alienation, or defiance, depending upon the locale. The ideal of abundance versus the realities of the shortage economy. Command economy was a shortage economy. A shortage economy, whether or not it was funneling most of its resources to the military. There was the ideal of the final crisis of capitalism is just around the corner, versus the awareness of growing consumerism and democracy in capitalist countries of North America, Western Europe, and East Asia. And then there's the ideal of growing political and economic equality. That's what building communism was said to be all about. The ideal of growing political and economic equality versus the privileges of what Gilas called the new class, what many others have called bureaucratism. Now, there were also varied elite responses to this societal alienation. There was differential elite interest in reforming the command economy. The Stalinist despotic regimes, no reforms. The bureaucratic Leninist regimes, minor reforms. The market Leninist regimes, major economic reforms. There was also differential elite receptivity to allowing the awareness of the capitalist world's attractions, whether economic or political. Stalinist regimes sought to impose isolation, think North Korea and Albania, or Mao during the Cultural Revolution. Bureaucratic Leninist regimes I'll call not isolation but insulation, a degree of permeability but tightly controlled. I mean, in Moscow you could listen to the BBC if you were so inclined, but it was not open awareness of what was happening in the West. And then of course opening is the feature of market Leninism. But of course all of them sought to maintain the leading role of the Communist Party. Interestingly, there were very varied leadership responses to bureaucratism, to the privileged new class and the increasingly corrupt new class. Brezhnev accommodated it. That's what Brezhnevism was largely about, bureaucratic Leninism. Khrushchev and Castro tried to marginally reduce the extent of privileges. They were resistant to both full-scale bureaucratic Leninism and Stalinism. And so they tried, in the name of the ideals, to reduce the extent of the privileges, but not to attack the ruling class. Mao attacked the ruling class. Mao mobilized the masses against officialdom. I call this populist despotism. The Kim family in North Korea allowed privileges to be retained by the elite, but kept officialdom in constant fear for its life. Same with Hoxha in Albania. So that was bureaucratic as opposed to populist despotism. Gorbachev ended the impunity of the new class through glasnost and electoral accountability, democratization from within. Also, the same was happening or emerging during the Prague Spring. And Deng Xiaoping's China and beyond, and Laos and Vietnam bought off the new class to induce them to cooperate with marketization. Market Leninism would not have worked were it not for the ability to buy off party officials and allow them to see it as in their interest, financial interest, to allow marketization and privatization. A wonderful book on this. It's penetratingly profound. So it's not bedtime reading, but I think you'd all enjoy it. Is by Yuen Ong of the University of Michigan. It's called How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. It's a brilliant book. And there were varied societal responses to bureaucratism. Well, in defiance of the regime's elite privileges, corruption, and or unaccountability were an issue in all the defiance from 1956 to 91. You had dissent, rebellion, or revolution, violent or not, in Poland, 3 different years, in Hungary, in the rest of Eastern Europe, in China, the Democracy Wall of 78, 79, in Tiananmen Square of June 1989, though neither of those was able to sustain itself in the face of regime repression. And then you had, of course, the sprouting of a democratizing ideology of Euro-communism. And I think these responses, sometimes repetitive and violent, sometimes non-violent but repetitive, and having an ideological crutch in Euro-communism, which also developed in Eastern Europe, I think that contributed to an elite demoralization that has to be factored into understanding the collapse of European communism. So, determinants of difference, back to the explanatory exercise again. This time the outcome is diverse postures toward Moscow's leadership of the world communist movement. Why was that? Well, I think one factor was the diverse pathways to power. Yugoslavia, Albania, China, Vietnam, Cuba, these were regimes that all came to power, even though Castro took a few years to declare himself a communist, all came to power autonomous of Moscow. Moscow might have given some assistance here and there, but essentially these were regimes that came to power largely on their own. And therefore the regime was viewed by society as the engine of national liberation, versus regimes being viewed in much of Eastern Europe as anti-national if they were viewed as having been imposed by the Red Army after World War II. Now, note that the remaining 5 communist regimes today, China, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, and Laos, 3 of them are of decidedly autonomous origins, China, Cuba, and Vietnam, or had broad legitimacy when they came to power with outside assistance, meaning North Korea and Laos. So nationalism became a legitimizing ideology for regimes that somehow either went the marketization route or in any case retained their power after the collapse of European communism. But another thing that's notable about most of these regimes, maybe all, I'm not sure, is the large role for the military in their leaderships. And that goes along with whatever path they took after the collapse of European communism, and goes along with the emphasis on nationalism as a legitimizing ideology. So you have the military, which is the guardian of the regime in a sense, and the guardian of national interest, being incorporated into these regimes, it goes back a long way in a number of these regimes, but it's very different from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. You might have had the Minister of Defense and the Politburo, but you didn't have this kind of party military elite that you have today in so many of these regimes. Another difference is the timing of revolutions, the USSR versus the others. We're trying to understand now why you got this drive to difference in inter-communist relations. I love this slide because I love this paragraph in my book. The political generational differences among the leaders of these states. Distinguish between founders and successors. And remember that originally Moscow's leadership was sacralized. It was viewed as, more than just, this is the person in charge. This is the enlightened regime that is the origin of communism in power, that has the right and the wisdom to dictate our course. Well, if Lenin were alive, you could make that case more easily. Stalin, well, these regimes came to power so long after Stalin was in power that you could almost think of him as the founder. But once you get to Breslauer, you're dealing with the successor to the successor to the successor to Lenin. And that sacralization wears thin. And I'm sure, maybe Puck knows more about this than I do, that Mao must have thought of Khrushchev as, he was the successor to the successor to Lenin, as something of an upstart. And who was he to dictate to these people who had founded their own communist regime, and in the case of China, the largest population in the world. But then there was the nuclearism factor. Nuclearism hung over the entire post-Stalin era, because both the United States and by the time of Stalin's death, the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons and were fast accumulating the capacity to deliver them. And this was an existential haunting that different communist leaders reacted to differently. What I call it is a varied impact on risk acceptance in the anti-imperialist struggle. So China in the Korean War, they took a big risk in going in big time into Korea, and they were willing to do that, not knowing whether the United States, which had nuclear weapons, would use them, and MacArthur was advocating for it. The Sino-Soviet split, the more I read about it, the more I'm convinced the nuclear factor was the deciding factor in the Sino-Soviet split. Khrushchev was spooked by the prospect that nuclear war could actually, he sought to use the specter of nuclear war as a way of getting his way, but when push came to shove, he was really scared about nuclear war. While the Chinese leadership, whatever might have been their inner feelings, was talking already in 1957 at a Communist Party conference in Moscow about how nuclear war wouldn't be that bad a thing. We'd still be left with a couple of 100 million people. We'd be able to conquer capitalism after that. Capitalist world would be destroyed. The Khrushchev leadership heard this in horror. And then in 58 and 59 and 60, Mao was testing Khrushchev's willingness, whether in the Taiwan Straits or in Timor-Matsu or India, willingness to back up China with his nuclear umbrella in pursuit of its national interests. And Khrushchev was not willing to do that. Mao understood that after the fact, and that, I think, was the deciding factor in this split, rather than viewing the decisive factor as being Mao's critique of Khrushchev's consumerist ideology. North Vietnam versus the United States. They just kept fighting and fighting and fighting, despite the fact that the U.S. had nuclear weapons. And, they didn't know that the U.S. would not use them. The U.S. had used them before to end a long war. But they were willing to take that risk. In the Cultural Revolution, 68, 69, you had border clashes between China and the Soviet Union, which appear to have been initiated, correct me if I'm wrong, by China. And were really cases in nuclear brinksmanship. China had nuclear weapons at that time, but not a lot of them, and not much by way of ability to deliver them. But did you know that in the spring of 1969, after Nixon and Kissinger were in place in Washington, D.C., Moscow floated a balloon through diplomatic channels to Washington, asking whether Washington would accept a Soviet strike on Chinese nuclear facilities.
Wow.
And Kissinger, who had a different plan in mind, he wanted to play them off against each other. He didn't want one to destroy the other. He said, "Don't you dare!" And so Moscow backed off. But these were different approaches to risk acceptance in the nuclear era. The Cuban Missile Crisis, we now know that Castro was very upset that the Soviets pulled out their missiles and would have liked Moscow to use them to ensure that the United States knew they were being serious. And he was very upset with Khrushchev. The Kim family, of course, in North Korea has used nuclear brinksmanship continuously. Finally, there's the role of individual leaders, their predispositions, as a causal factor in triggering many of these diverse choices. Structural factors, of course, both internal and international, may shape the parameters within which leaders can exercise discretion. But individual leaders' predispositions determine what choices they make within those parameters, and also whether they're going to try to defy those structural limits. And so my final point here is that the history of communist states provides a lot of evidence for the notion of exceptional leaders. And by here exceptional, I don't mean admirable. I mean probably no one else in the leadership could have done it or would have been inclined to do it. And so that's what I mean by exceptional. So Khrushchev and de-Stalinization, Gorbachev and perestroika, Tito and the defiance of Stalin and helping to found the non-aligned movement, Ceausescu's navigation of an international middle way. I'll have to consult with some Romania specialists about that, but I have a sense that that was skillfully done by him, and that others in the leadership might not have. I'll have to drop an email to Ken Jow and ask him what his take is on that. Enver Hoxha in Albania and Kim Il-sung in North Korea, decisions to maintain despotism, their decision to establish a family dynasty in North Korea. Mao Zedong's break with the USSR, his great leap forward, his cultural revolution, his military battles with the USSR. I think these were reflections of Mao's will. Deng Xiaoping's burst through toward market Leninism in the ideal of Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. I suspect Xi Jinping's backlash against the side effects of market Leninism and his movement now toward a meld of bureaucratic Leninism and market Leninism, and we'll see whether that amalgam goes anywhere. Fidel Castro kept the revolutionary ideals alive. He was a looming and forceful presence. Whenever there were those in the leadership who wanted to try out a different course in the 70s and the 80s, I'm told by a Cuba specialist that I called up to ask him about this. He said the guy was unstoppable. He would show up and give a 6-hour speech and intimidate everybody into not sacrificing too much of the ideals, however much it might have made economic sense. In the rest of Eastern Europe and in Mongolia, I think there's less need to invoke the names of party leaders unless you're seeking to explain variance within bureaucratic Leninism. So rather than thinking in terms of voluntarism versus determinism, you know, the old battle in political theory about whether you think about the evolution of regimes in terms of voluntarism or determinism, I think of it more as on the heels of the accumulation of contradictions during a long reign. The death of the founder or the death or displacement of a successor triggers a search for a hoped-for new equilibrium at home and abroad. And it's at those points in time that exceptional leaders often emerge to tackle those contradictions. And I think the fates of these remaining 5 communist regimes may teach us more about this. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, George. We are, I think, 4 or 5 minutes ahead of the schedule that Linda very carefully provided for us. So we have lots of time for discussion, which is terrific. But thank you first, before we proceed, for a really stimulating presentation. I think what you have done for us is to put contingency and choice right at the heart of the history of the world communist movement. And since these are preoccupations of historians, contingency and choice, it feels like a sort of fitting point on which to segue to our 2 interlocutors, Puck Engman and John Connelly. I think the plan is for John to go first, and then for Puck to deliver a response. So John, I turn this over to you.
Thank you. So first I want to say this is a great event in the history of the University of California, Berkeley Slavic Studies Group. Because this is really a major book that has come out of a very productive group of scholars who have been at work here for over half a century. And sitting in this room, I'm actually reminded of an event that took place about 28 years ago. I'm trying to figure out exactly when. It was after a book called The Soviet Tragedy had emerged by my colleague Martin Malia, and this is the last time I recall this room being set up like this, and we had actually a panel here, and people standing in the back. I was among those standing in the back. But up front was Vicky Bonnell, insisting that, from sociology, insisting that something had changed, a major thing had changed in world politics, and we had to take cognizance of it. And Martin Malia was back there somewhere, shaking his head constantly, as you can imagine, with everything that Vicky and Reggie, not so much Ken Zhao had said, but it was this great group of scholars who were trying to grapple with big questions, and each of them was major authority. And in a sense, George, you're among that group, and I think of you that way. And but I have to make a confession, which is that I think over the years I've become more attracted to Martin's way of thinking, which you will see in a moment. But the book is a joy to read. It's also like Martin's and other books that have been produced in Berkeley over the decades. It's an ambitious book. We hear the words tour de force used a lot. This really is a tour de force. This is a book that really shies from no big questions, goes across the globe. It deals with authority, with movements in many continents over many decades. The tone is moderate. I would even say liberal. The effect, I think, is enlightening, edifying. It's a courageous book. in a number of ways, and I think above all, it's a needed book because we don't have anything like this. This is basic guidance to major ideology of the 20th century that we're in danger of forgetting about. So it's a landmark. But George, as you know, once you launch a big work into the world, it sort of takes on a life of its own, generates questions that you may not have anticipated or welcomed, and that's what I'm going to do now is pursue it my own, which won't be foreign to you, but also relates in some ways to our own heritage as Slavic people, right? That's what we, in a sense, you and I are, we're Slavicists. Another institute that George was and has been extremely important for his Institute for Slavic Studies at Berkeley. So I just want to recognize that as well. Slavic East European and Eurasian Studies. So my basic sort of question, or the thing that's provoked from reading the book, is this: when we try to figure out what we make of communism, do we act more as judges, or do we act as analysts? Okay. Communism is a huge subject. It's more than history of a single country. It's even more, in some senses, than international history. You could say that it's history of humanity in recent decades, certainly from the 20th century onward into the present. And so I think we can ask whether it was a, forgive the term, progressive force for humanity. It called itself progressive. Was it really that? I think it's not unfair to ask questions like that of communism, because communism, unlike liberalism, promised not just to establish the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but actually to establish a regime, a reality of life, liberty, and happiness. So people would not merely seek happiness, they would be happy under communism. So there's a very high demand, and I urge you to think of images that you might have in mind from undergraduate courses where Stalin is portrayed with children smiling, right? I mean, that's kind of the image of the future, is everybody somehow transported into a world of happiness. So what I've just been saying, I haven't used this word, but it might seem to some of you like a moral judgment. It might seem to be judging and moralizing. This is a long-standing issue in Slavic studies in the history of communism. Sheila Fitzpatrick, I'll now invoke, she's a leading historian of the Soviet Union. She was actually the teacher of Yuri Sleskin, another person who spoke here 28 years ago, by the way, in this room, in this space, on this issue. I don't remember what Yuri said, but Sheila was his teacher at the University of Texas. So Sheila Fitzpatrick wrote a best-selling history of the Russian Revolution. It's gone through, I think, 4 editions, maybe 5. In the first edition from 1982, she lamented the fate of E.H. Carr, an early historian of the Russian Revolution. People had criticized him for not being himself critical enough, for not using explicitly moral judgments in dealing with the Russian Revolution. So I'll read from Sheila's work, 1982. Political analysis has often come uncomfortably close to political partisanship in Western Soviet ethology. And this clearly has some connection with the impact of the Cold War on the formative years of American Soviet studies. And when she said Cold War in 1982, she thought it was in the past, which is kind of interesting. But it has outlived the Cold War, and in fact was never the exclusive prerogative of one ideological group. She herself refused to use the word totalitarian to describe communist regimes. She explicitly said that was a political word and not a word of analysis. And then at the end of this introduction to her book, she said, "We may dislike dictatorship and approve of upward mobility." She did. I don't know whether she disliked dictatorship, but she approved of upward mobility, or conceivably even reversed these preferences. But history, this is the important sentence that sticks in my mind, history has not consulted us. And we really have to deal with what seems to have happened and how it fits together. A remarkable sentence. The Russian Revolution is now part of history, not an aspect of contemporary politics. In this book, I have tried to treat it as such. That's the first edition. You will not find those words in editions that came out after 1989. They disappeared. They're gone. In a sense, she seems to admit herself that you can't separate the story of communism and the Russian Revolution in some way from current political and by extraction moral concerns. So this is diverging from what you spoke about just now, George, but it's in the book at the beginning. You said you actually wouldn't talk about this today, but it occurred to me as something that interested you. That your project was not appreciation or damnation. That's at the beginning, but at the end, in fact, you do, as you mentioned, you talk about, or you ask, or you explore whether we can think of communism as tragedy or communism as achievement. And so what is achievement? Achievement means things that we would consider to be positive, like industrialization, growth, economic growth, relative income equality, replacement of old elites, which stand against progress, education of the masses. But now, leaving aside the question of what kind of industry and what kind of education communism promoted, we'll say something about education in a moment, and whether arrests and mass murders and lawlessness are the appropriate way to replace old elites. Does one really need communism for the basic challenge of stepping from traditional to modern society and replacing elites, building a modern economy? People used to say, by the way, I was a student in communist Poland for a number of years, and a joke back then used to be communism was the longest detour from capitalism to capitalism. You probably heard this before. But it was arguably also a derailing of liberal democracy, the creation of an illiberal order, a very solid liberal order. People used to accuse Francis Fukuyama of naivete for speaking of the end of history in 1989. His article was actually much more sophisticated than that. But I have not heard strong evidence against the proposition that after all other experiments have been tried, fascism, communism, other forms of populism, the most equitable and peaceful way for humans to resolve difficult issues of social conflict that are always with us is indeed some form of liberal democracy. Here we could say that communism took societies into realms of illiberalism that make transition to liberal democracy very difficult. That, in some senses, is the historical role of communism in one reading. It's my reading. So what communism accomplished was to pulverize civil society, breaking up all forms of self-organization that are crucial for liberal democracy. There are a few exceptions to this, and we can talk about them. Go to my page. Other side of the page. Further, communism habituates people to a series not just of lies, but of uncontested lies, untruths. Most consequentially about themselves and where they came from, about their history. I brought a show and tell piece to show you what I mean. This is an East German communist textbook, Geschichte 10. So it's the 10th grade version of history. This book has nothing of use inside of it. It's a distortion of every event that it talks about from the French Revolution forward, especially post-World War I history. So in East Germans, 17 million of them, were essentially left ignorant about how Hitler came to power, what the Holocaust was, whether it happened or not, how German democracy emerged, and of course, what communism was about. So expand this 17 million to how many citizens did the USSR have? 200 million or so, maybe slightly fewer, and then to other states that were or maybe are still under communist rule. We have a huge problem. One imagines indeed a transition from liberalism to liberalism. How much work does it take to instantiate a range of opinions in place of simplification, untruth, and dogma? I'm never going to do two-sided printing again. Communist schools were arguably incubators of dangerous ignorance, without which, moving to the present now, without which support in Russia for the war in Ukraine is not conceivable. Denied access to books like George's, I'm guessing this is not going into print in Moscow anytime soon.
They declined to publish it.
You see. So, denied access to books like George's, Russians regard Stalin not just as one of the century's great criminals, but as a great leader. They think of their country as a virtuous nation state whose imperial claims are justified and natural, and so on. I won't belabor the point. So how does one undo generations of misinformation? By contrast, the challenges facing Germany after fascism, after Nazism in 1945, were relatively easy. That was 12 years. So above I asked whether one needs communism for the step to modernity. Now I get to this issue of contingency that Daniel brought up. For a historian interested in turning points and contingencies, what is striking is how the communist experiment almost did not happen. This is something that I note from George's book and other literature as well. What we know about communism, world communism, it all starts in 1917, right? That's a crucial turning point. That's the contingent moment. That is linked to Lenin his comrades and the Communist Party. So what amazes me about 1917 are two things. How the coming to power of the Bolsheviks, while as George says in his excellent chapter on this subject, indeed met the hopes and demands of many radicalized soldiers and workers, especially in Petrograd and Moscow, Lenin himself consistently stood almost alone among the Bolsheviks in pushing for revolutionary change. I don't know whether you all know this, but Stalin himself, Trotsky and others have basically said, hold on, it's not the moment for a revolution. We still have to go through a bourgeois stage in our development. Lenin was almost alone in the party leadership in pushing for change. He was the one person who said we cannot cooperate with the provisionary government, etc. He had to cajole constantly, threaten resignation, and ultimately was, as we know, victorious. Without that man and his will, you don't get what we know as the Russian Revolution. You don't get the rest of George's very well told story. But if you expand the canvas a bit beyond Russia in 1917, what you can't help noticing is how an absolutely marginal force in European Marxism, Bolshevism, was really very marginal and extreme at that point, got to define what Marxism meant for humanity. It's an extraordinary thing. We can talk a bit about this. Actually, I found these parts of the book quite interesting. George's discussion of how you go from Marxism to actual communism in power. Otherwise, if you go back to the early years of the 20th century before the First World War, Marxist parties were overwhelmingly dominated by moderates. For example, the German SPD, which was by far the largest European Marxist party, was a party that was completely against revolution. In 1918, there's a famous meeting that takes place in Berlin of Soviets, of the German version of Soviets, and they overwhelmingly vote against revolution and for what we call liberal democracy. So they became essentially Democrats, these German Marxists. But after the fact, after 1920, we think of Bolshevism as somehow incorporating Marxism. So just one final comment. It's not, I was thinking how to make this into a question. I'm not sure one can make it into a question. But if you look at George's CV, among the many things that he's done over the years, a central concern has been this issue of leadership. And you really can't help noticing how throughout his story in this book, but also beyond the book and what we know about communist regimes, we're always associating not just the regime, but changes in regime with individuals, right? So Lenin did what he did, as I described, and then Stalin comes along, and both the beginning of Stalinism and the end of Stalinism is explained by what? By Stalin. I found it remarkable that, George, when you were talking about why there's diversity after 1953, because Stalin died. If Stalin had lived to be 100, then presumably Stalinism itself would have continued. Other communist regimes we associate with individuals. There's Maoism, there's Ho Chi Minh, there's Tito, right? Absolutely crucial. Then you don't explain the end of communism without Gorbachev. It's almost as though one person were acting. What we have now is in some ways also a very personalistic regime in Putin. It's just remarkable how those countries seem to produce regimes that are associated with single individuals. So that's something I couldn't help remarking upon. I don't have an explanation for it, George. Maybe you do. I wonder whether we need Vicky here and Reggie and our other colleagues maybe to explain to us what the combination is between politics, society, economics. Greg Grossman, but also a great colleague of ours. It all came together in some ways at Berkeley, and it comes together very nicely in this book, which I very much recommend to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John. So let me now turn the discussion over to Puck.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was not here 20 years ago in this room. I was not even
Born.
Yeah, I was born, but I was barely born when the wall fell. So, I have no memory of actually existing socialism. For me, actually existing socialism has never actually existed. In my memory, that's the perspective that I speak from. So you can imagine that it's quite daunting for me to be here and to comment. And so what I would like to do is to start being supposedly a specialist of China, I want to start with the question that you raised, what about China, right? So, as you probably have seen if you've followed the news in recent days, there's the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party ongoing right now in Beijing, right? And if you've tuned in or if you've seen pictures, you're gonna see everyone collected in the Great Hall of the People in a sea of red, right? There are red banners, there are red ties, there are even these small red name tags with little hammers and sickles on them. And so it's all very, very red, very communist, and in this Great Hall of the People, Xi Jinping held his opening speech and he said, and I quote, "Marxism is the fundamental guiding ideology upon which our party and country are founded and thrive. Our experience has taught us that we owe the success to the fact that Marxism works, particularly when it is adapted to the Chinese context and the needs of our times." End quote. Right, so the question of course is, what do we make of this, right? Is this pure rhetoric? Is it just symbolism? Are these hammers and sickles basically the equivalent of the French national flag and its relation to the revolution? Or is there something more here? So here, turning to the book actually gives us a pretty easy tool to start kind of evaluating it. The book is extremely clear, and that's one of the many things that makes it so easy to read, right? It's 100 years in 320 pages, and everything is extremely clear. So one thing which is set up is a set of 5 common features between these communist states, and I'm not going to go into them now, but only one of them really can be said to be there still in China today, and that is a Leninist party that is still in power, right? That is dominating the political system. Others might be applicable, that can be discussed, but only one of them is unambiguously relevant for China today, right? So it seems that the only thing, if we think of it as basically ideology and organization, the organization is still there. The ideology seems to, in a lot of ways, have changed so much that it's not even recognizable as communism anymore. Again, of course, this is something we can discuss. But my point is that, as you mentioned during the presentation, market Leninism, as it's developed in China, has integrated so much into the global capitalist system that it has fundamentally changed what Chinese society is. And beyond that, as you said, the collective project of world communism is no longer there. China is not kind of plotting a revolution or coordinating foreign policy with other communist regimes, right? So world communism in this sense is a thing of the past. So, that makes sense. That's why I'm here today. I'm one of 2 historians commenting on this book. So what I wanted to focus on then is, what does it mean to study communism as a thing of the past? Because that's also where George's book opens. It opens with the demise of world communism, and it kind of introduces this book that we co-edited in 1970, and the kind of discipline of comparative capitalism, comparative communism, which compared different communist societies that were different communist regimes that were installed in societies that were culturally, geographically, economically very diverse, right? So there's this comparative exercise, and the question then becomes, how does this comparative exercise change once world communism no longer exists? How do you write the story of world communism, or how do you write comparative communism in the past tense? So that's what I found very interesting about how this book is structured. And it's not, I think, importantly, it's not a work by a historian. It doesn't read like a work of a historian, it reads like a work of a social scientist. And as someone who works on the history of socialism, right, we owe a lot to social scientists, right? All histories of any socialist nation, the first things that we would go to, the first histories were written by social scientists and area specialists. They were not written by historians, right? So one of my colleagues, another PRC historian, he recently put it as social scientists wrote the first draft of socialist history. And of course, this is, as kind of this book illustrates, this is not something that's just took place in the past and now historians have taken over, but social scientists continue to make contribution and shape how we think about the history of communism. This book is an example. In the work cited in the book, we have other examples. So, just gonna give you one quick example is there's an excellent chapter in here on the Cultural Revolution, which in 5 pages really manages to compress so much of recent research on the Cultural Revolution. George defines it as a period starting in 1966 and ending in 1969, which is different from kind of the standard Communist Party version, which is that it's a decade of turmoil, and very much in line with the most recent research on the Cultural Revolution. He gives a complex and accurate account of the Cultural Revolution in 5 pages, and he's able to do so because he's been drawing on the work of another prominent social scientist, Andrew Walder, sociologist at Stanford University, who's really been at the forefront of kind of rewriting the history of the Cultural Revolution. So the social sciences then have shaped how we write the history of state socialism, but how does the switch to this historical mode change the way that comparative communism is written? Here I think the book suggests that there are at least 2 changes that come with this switch to the historical mode. The first change has to do with complexity, right? So we have, historians have started writing about communism since the opening of the archives. The archives have opened to different degrees in different places, but in all countries, this has led to a picture that is more accurate, in some ways more clear, definitely richer than before, but it's also a picture that is far more complex than before. Unavoidably, by discovering new documents, new voices, new vocabularies, we've ended up with an idea of world communism which is far more complex than before. And since this is very much a book that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't cite archival documents, it doesn't draw directly on archival documents, but it very much draws on scholarship informed by archival documents. So the archival opening very much shapes how the book is written. And that kind of, I think, speaks to what a major accomplishment it is to write a 320-page book about this 100-year period. This enterprise is actually even more complex now than it was in the 1970s, right? And I think even more so because studying world communism in the past tense is not just about the added complexity of new archival material, but it also implies that we have to bring in a second comparative framework. So you spoke a bit about this, that you're not just comparing obviously between countries anymore, but you're comparing between different systems and over time at the same time. And I wanted to kind of give two examples of how these two comparative frames come together to shed light on kind of some key events in the history of the communist movement. And I'm gonna, I apologize, I'm gonna draw on elements from Chinese history because that's what I know. So the first example, which I really found extremely striking, is the juxtaposition of Mao Zedong and Khrushchev and Brezhnev, right? So we have two Soviet leaders, Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Mao was, always there. And what's interesting is that this juxtaposition suggests something about a parallel evolution in how the communist horizon was imagined in the Soviet Union and in China. So let me explain what I mean there. In the late 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev thought optimistically, but not necessarily without reason, that Soviet growth would continue, that the Soviet economy would continue to grow, and that it would be possible for the Soviet Union to overtake the United States within 20 years. Something that coincidentally many American economists at this time also thought, right? So for Mao, I would say this suggested two things. The first thing was that the Stalinist growth model actually worked. That the Stalinist growth model could take a relatively poor country through industrialization, right? Through this investment into heavy industry, and that this kind of growth model was something that could work. Secondly, it told him that if China didn't speed up its own industrialization, it would be left behind, right? So what Mao does, obviously, is that he becomes even more optimistic, and he adopts, the China moves towards the Great Leap Forward, where a sudden shift in agricultural productivity will release labor from the countryside and make possible the rediversion of labor into industry, rapid industrialization. Of course, this is leads up to the famine, to the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward. And here is where, for me, it became very interesting. Because for me, and for many historians of the People's Republic of China, there's a shift here in Mao's thinking after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, where Mao increasingly starts putting off the communist horizon, right? In the Great Leap Forward, the idea is that we're building quickly towards communism. After the Great Leap Forward, Mao tends towards this way of thinking of communism that is something very far into the future. There will be a sustained period where classes will still be present in some remnant form in socialism, and there will still be class struggle, right? He also starts moving towards increasing hostility towards the bureaucracy, as I always thought, as a result of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, right? But what becomes interesting here, because it's so succinct, is that we can also think of this in context of Brezhnev's move at the same time, which seems very different because it's technocratic, it's bureaucratic Leninism, but at the same time there's the same impulse to postpone communism into the indefinite future. Brezhnev does not want to speak about communism in his lifetime, right? So that for me is something very interesting and something that I think only comes through as clearly because of the way that this book is written, right? It puts these two in relief in a way that lets us think of these things that are all well known, right? But we can think of them in a new way. And so we have a common problem, the collapse of the communist future, the collapse of the horizon of communism, but very different reactions. Right? In the case of the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, we have bureaucracy and technocratic policies. In China, as the book makes very clear, we have kind of we have this in the beginning. We have two approaches. The first approach is to restore bureaucratic, the workings of the bureaucracy. It's to adopt some forms of austerity politics in order to get out of the crisis of the Great Leap Forward. But then we also have the kind of different approach, which is Mao's approach, where he leads an attack on the bureaucracy. He becomes increasingly skeptical of the party state, and this, of course, leads up to the Cultural Revolution. Then the other thing that I wanted to talk about briefly is the main contention of the book, that socialist states follow the same script in building socialism up to Stalin's death. Right? So that's true even in a very literal sense. Right? There's Stalin's short course on the history of the Bolshevik Party, which leads up to, it ends in 1937, it ends with a chapter on the Constitution and the Great Terror, right? So after that, there's no script anymore. And scholars have pointed to, in the case of Mao Zedong, that he was, truly inspired and impressed by the story as told in Stalin's short course. At the same time, it seems to me that the Chinese case complicates this story of similarity leading to difference after Stalin's death, and it does so in two ways. The first is that, unlike in some countries where Stalinism was more or less imposed, Mao actually was more Stalinist than Stalin. Mao, Stalin, who continuously Stalin had a kind of long history of always pushing the Communist Party in China again, holding them back, right? Saying that let the Kuomintang be in charge, and so on and so forth. And even after 1949, what Stalin says is that it's not time for socialism in China. As John pointed out, Stalin, in the context of the Russian Revolution, was also holding back. And he, after 1949, he also thinks it's not time for socialism in China yet. And so what happens in China is that as soon as Stalin dies, that's when the real Stalinization starts. That's when Mao shifts to building socialism. And he does so within months of Stalin's death. And he adopts a general line for the transition to socialism, and 3 years later, all private enterprise is gone. Right? So that seems to me to complicate the story of diversity after Stalin's death. The second reason would be related to the institutions of Mao's China and Chinese socialism. Because they are modeled on Stalinist institutions, definitely. But the book also distinguishes between Mao's populist despotism and Stalin's bureaucratic despotism, and this is also mirrored in how the institutions develop in the two contexts. In the Chinese context, they start building Stalinist constitutions in the 1950s, but these institutions in many ways are never brought to the same level of development as in the Soviet Union. The clearest example is the sphere of law, right? law in Mao's China does not at all have the same role as it does in Stalin's Soviet Union. So much so that when we get to the post-Mao leadership, they have to telescope Stalinist development. They have to telescope socialist development and first install Stalinism. They have to install kind of Soviet legal codes that have been drafted in the 1950s but never implemented. And only when they've installed Stalinism can they quickly move to bureaucratic Leninism and then into market Leninism. So that again, I think, seems to add some complexity, and I'm sorry, that's kind of what historians do. We always try to add complexity. But it does seem to add some complexity to this story. Very generally, trying to get out of my kind of China centricism, the question might be put more generally: how did the post-war evolution of Stalinism in the Soviet Union as the center for the world communist movement, how did that affect the kind of national development of socialism in all these different countries? Right? How do we think of the national histories of building socialism in relation to the transnational history of communism in the post-war world? And the final thing, and this is more kind of, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Returning to Xi Jinping, after you have some of this in the book, but things move quickly, right? So some of these things have changed. So I was wondering, after the trade war, after the pandemic, after the ban on semiconductors that we had from the Biden administration last week, how do we interpret Xi Jinping's comments about Marxism at the National Congress? Is the relevant question still if the Communist Party and its model for market Leninism will survive in a globalized world, or is the question, will globalization survive long enough to outlive the Chinese Communist Party?
Great. John and Puck have given us, or rather George, a great deal with which to grapple. So I wonder, George, if you'd like to give a quick response, maybe just 4 or 5 minutes, which would leave time to engage some audience questions.
Sure. 3 years ago, a book that I wrote called Gorbachev and Yeltsin as Leaders was translated into Russian in Moscow and published for sale in Russia and other Russophone countries. It was a very congenial experience. The only change they forced upon me was that when I referred in the last pages to Yeltsin's successor, Putin, who had been a spy for the KGB, they changed that to employee of the KGB. And I decided not to fight that. But then when last year I sent them a copy of this book and asked them whether they'd like to, this is the Academic Studies Press, it's called, whether they'd like to translate it and publish it in Russia. They read the book, they had an editorial board meeting, and they said it's too politically sensitive. Even though I don't think I even mentioned Putin in this entire book, because it ends with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. But that to me was a foreboding, actually. Liberalism might be the greatest thing ever invented. I don't know whether liberalism could survive the impact on Russia of World War I and the Civil War that followed. But that's to some extent a moot point now. We might have wished for it. I don't know whether in those real circumstances it could have survived. As you quoted me, I tried to write this book not as an act of admiration or damnation, And in my chapters evaluating the communist experience, whether it's Mao or Stalin or communism in general, I tried to be as even-handed as possible, but maybe that's what I'm guilty of. Thank you for calling it a tour de force. Gregory Grossman once responded to that statement by saying, I hope it's not a forced detour. Short chapters. You know, there are 43 chapters plus an introduction in this book, so effectively 44 chapters in 326 pages. I got the inspiration for that from Dan Brown when I read his Da Vinci Code and realized I couldn't put it down because each of these short chapters kept me turning the page, and so I wanted to keep people turning the page and never get bogged down at any one point. Each person will have to decide whether I've succeeded in that regard. Thank you, Puck, for the complexification. The notion of Stalin opposing building socialism in China in 49 to 53 is new to me, actually. I'll have to mull that as to what it does for my argument there. What's interesting to me is that the Marxist and so-called Leninist inspiration, you know, Lenin's last struggle, Moshe Levine, and his last comments while he was ill about the direction of the bureaucracy and of Stalin and so on. So that aspect of Lenin plus the early Marx and Marxism in general, I think you know, became, if not an inspiration, at least a point of justification that you can point back to. So Gorbachev really believed that Lenin was his inspiration for his democratization campaign, whether he was delusional or not. The Prague Spring went back to the early Marx, and they really thought that they were being faithful to the ideological heritage. So I guess the lesson is that many ideological heritages have multiple components that are in tension with each other, and therefore they evolve over time, and people can point back to one or the other. In the Brezhnev era, of course, the joke among establishment dissidents was to come into the office and say, in Russian, "Good morning," as Lenin said. Martin Melia wrote this book, The Soviet Tragedy. J.P. Nettle, 20 years earlier, or 25 years earlier, wrote this book called The Soviet Achievement. And so I was playing them off against each other in that part of the book. You know, Andrew Walder wrote a very, very hard-hitting book on Mao. And I was contrasting that in my mind as I was reading in the Chinese studies literature with Maurice Meisner's book, Mao's China and After. And I saw them with such different emphasis. And Andrew Walder is on tyranny and ineffectuality, or worse, while Meisner is focused on social policy and egalitarian values. And I suppose you could say that Meisner gives Mao the benefit of the doubt too often, and Walder is unrelenting in denunciation. And I noticed that in Walder's bibliography, Maurice Meisner's book didn't even appear. So I'm not sure what's going on in the sociology of knowledge in the China field, but it might be analogous to Melia versus Nettle in the Soviet field.
Great. So let's open this up for questions.
Andrei Krikovic from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, former PhD here. George was one of my mentors, also former IIS fellow, so it's really nice to see these events are still happening, and really great, masterful presentation and very profound comments. So I just have one quick comment and then one question for George. A comment to John. Certainly I would agree with a lot of what you said about this distortion of history by communism and these Leninist legacies, if you think of Jowett, and the effect and rise in Putinism that we see today. But I also wouldn't lose sight of the fact that, you know, unbridled neoliberal capitalism can have the same kind of distortive effects on history, on social development. And when we look at the rise of this regime that's waging, you know, this kind of fratricidal war of aggression in Ukraine, we shouldn't lose sight that it's, you know, partly due to a failed experiment in liberalism. So it's, you know, not just a, you know, the Leninist legacy in that story. The question for George, this is an intriguing kind of framework for understanding how these regimes change, what the drivers for divergence and change are. And as someone that does work on China from the international relations perspective, I find it just baffling why change something that's working so well. So if you can maybe comment, do you see, you talked about these kind of crises of post-Stalinism. Do you see analogous ones rising out of market Bolshevism? Or is this just a power play of sorts by, is this driven by Xi's leadership, his need for power, and his very sort of adept way of, in a kind of stealthy way of, you know, cleaning house and gaining power for himself? So the old, you know, structure versus agency problem, if you could kind of comment on that. And where is China sort of heading?
I do have a chapter in the book on where is China heading, actually, applying different theories from the Western social science literature. Now, I haven't read Xi's speech, and so I'm at a disadvantage of talking about the details of what Xi is up to these days. But I think it's fruitful to think of it as an effort to create an amalgam of bureaucratic Leninism and market Leninism, to try to retain the advantages of both, advantages from his perspective. Now, amalgams can be stable or unstable, and that might be a very unstable amalgam. We don't know where it's going to head. When Xi came to power, Yuan Hong, whose book was not yet out, indicated that the great threat here is that the crackdown on corruption and the re-centralization of power was going to lead to a lack of initiative in the bureaucracy. And market Leninism required nimble, local level bureaucrats not seeking continuously to cover their behinds, but to actually take risks for the sake of economic improvement. And she thought that was going to lead to probably a rollback of some aspects of market Leninism that have been beneficial. And I think to some extent that prediction has come true. Where it's going to go from here, I'd be irresponsible to even speculate.
Yeah, I have, this is not my field, so it's kind of an environmental perspective related question. And I'd like to thank Puck for stating that real socialism has never really existed. I don't know if that's a generational thing, but certainly something that I also believe. I'm wondering about this difference. The word industrialization came up a lot. And from the environmental perspective, there's not really much difference between the industrialization of the communist world and the capitalist world. Especially when you consider a term that I recently learned, state capitalism, and what some of these regimes might have been really playing out. Recently in some work that I'm doing in Cuba related to food security, this idea of economic diversity and having opportunities for people to engage with the market in different ways came up. And when you consider or frame regimes in this kind of way of a kind of ask that people relate to each other, to the land and the market in a very specific way. This was done both in liberal and communist countries, which really limits the amount of economic diversity available for us to engage in. I wonder, your thoughts on this idea of state capitalism and whether there was some aspect of a performative communism or socialism that was going on when the relations between land and people were essentially the same kind of extractive relationships. I also wonder if Mao knew about nuclear winter and the impacts that a nuclear war would have had even on the surviving humans.
Nuclear winter actually became an issue in the early 1980s. I think it was their title. So back in the early 1960s when this was the issue, of course, some people reacted with horror. Most people reacted with horror at the prospect of nuclear war. What Mao might have thought personally, privately, in pillow talk, or what have you, I don't know. But his expression, his public expressions were, don't be too intimidated by nuclear weapons. As for industrialization and state capitalism and the like, socialism as an ideal, I agree with you, it's never existed as I would define the term on a nation-state level. What capitalist primitive accumulation and socialist primitive accumulation have in common, or state socialist primitive accumulation have in common, is what Jowett referred to as the production mentality. Produce more and more and more, and negative externalities on the environment were just not on their minds. Certainly not a priority, and it only became an issue way later in the Brezhnev regime, and they didn't do a heck of a lot about it either. My ideal society is the ideal of social democracy as practiced in Northern Europe. I'll be glad to hear that.
But he hasn't seen socialism, so that's not good.
But I don't refer to social democracy as socialism, because socialism, by my definition, has to entail the abolition of private property, and certainly social democracy doesn't do that.
Yeah, thanks. I really look forward to reading the book, George. A couple of things on the state capitalism. It's what I think Zhao Ziyang coined the term primary stage of socialism, right? Which you could call state capitalism, but that's the Chinese version of avoiding what they're actually doing. And then I actually did read Xi Jinping's speech. It took me 3 days, but I read it. Slept very well. And there's a constant reference to Marxism. The inspiration of Marxism, everything they do is inspired by Marxism. But you read the speech and there's absolutely nothing Marxist about it, except referring to Marxism. I mean, as I see it, a critical aspect of Marxism is class struggle. And there's absolutely nothing at all about class struggle. Because Mao said, I can't remember how it's translated into English, but never forget class struggle, right? And then what you had, Hu Jintao, who preceded Xi Jinping, talked about harmonize it, which is as un-Marxist as you can imagine, right? And so Xi Jinping then is talking about stability. His main emphasis is on stability and security, and linking together national sovereignty with domestic social stability, that you can't have one without the other. And to preserve sovereignty, you must have domestic stability. So it's nothing at all about harmony, nothing at all about class struggle. It's all about basically top-down, and with the whole surveillance apparatus that they built, it's just maintaining stability in order for China to achieve its rejuvenation, which is his focus is on national rejuvenation.
Does he ever talk with pride about having brought so many Chinese people
out of poverty? Oh, so that's another important line I picked up. The goal is to increase the size of the middle class. Now, so some of us who are old enough to have remembered modernization theory, the whole idea of Lips and so on is that you have a large middle class, which is a buffer between the rich and the poor, and that's going to bring about some of these other prerequisites of democracy, right? It's going to bring about democracy. And so here's Xi Jinping advocating an expansion of the middle class so that everybody will have a comfortable lifestyle, which has nothing to do. I mean, if you want to talk about communism in the future when I can be a fisherman in the morning and a carpenter in the evening, or the other way around. That there's nothing even of that sense of what it means to be happy and satisfied and to have built a successful system. Anyway.
Yeah, so Professor Breslauer, I had a question about what you mentioned regarding how those communist regimes that have outlived the demise of world communism have sort of legitimized themselves. So one thing you mentioned is nationalism, and I guess in the instance of China, that's very salient, whether it's the rhetoric of the Great Rejuvenation, but the other thing you mentioned was a larger role for military officers sort of in the party or in the bureaucracy. And that's something that, as I understand it, although admittedly my research focuses mostly on nuclear issues, that's absent in China. So I'm just curious, Dr. Puckman, your thoughts about why that might be the case, and if there's anything to take away from that has greater implications.
Well, in Cuba and Laos, the party military elite basically is fused, and that's presumably so that the military will protect the party in the face of defiance, and they share the wealth. They both get, the party officials and the military officials each get the take from corruption that's widespread. And in Laos, the subsistence farmers have not benefited much from the increase in GDP because it's all gone to the party military elite. The Kim dynasty, of course, is a case of despotism, but also the military is quite prominent in being co-opted for purposes of the regime. Vietnam, the military helped did the lion's share of the heavy lifting to reunite the country, and so you would expect them to be foregrounded as faces of the regime along with the party elite. How much does the military get representation at the top of the Chinese party?
I don't want, we can talk about it later. I don't want to take up time now. We can focus on
We have just 3 or 4 minutes left in the session, so if anybody has a succinct final question.
It won't be a succinct final question, but I'd like to challenge the word world. That is to say, the communist collection of states under the despotism of the Soviet Union in the early post-war period is a world in itself. China, as an enormous world power, is a world in itself. I'm not so sure. Obviously, the image of communism as an ascending concept justifies the word rise of world communism, but I don't see. I think that's a very time-bound issue.
Well, it certainly is if you're defining world communism as a united force. Once the Sino-Soviet split happens, that's over and you just get splintering. But until then, if you factor in all the numerous non-ruling communist parties, and they're coming to Moscow regularly for coordination and inspiration, and they refer to it as the Mировой коммунистический процесс, the world communist process.
The East Germans too.
Yeah.
But that sounds more like the Euro-communism issue, in the sense that you're including states there that were not under the vassalage structure of the Soviet Union. I don't know. I mean,
I think it's also justified by the vision.
yeah, that's where I agree. Yeah.
And if I had to, conceptualize it in international relations theory terms, I'd refer to it as an international subsystem.
And that seems actually like a sort of fitting point on which to conclude, given the venue. We're an Institute of International Studies. And I think one of the signal strengths of your book, George, is that what you've given us is not only an exercise in the comparative analysis of communism, but also an analysis of communism as an international system or a subsystem. So this is a book that is really comparative and international studies sort of at the same time. It's a remarkably broad accomplishment.
That's what I tried to do. I'm not going to call it an accomplishment. I'll wait for you guys to say. But thank you. I really appreciate both your giving me this opportunity to present the book and John's and Puck's profound comments and the questions from you. During COVID, I taught a freshman seminar by Zoom. I taught adult education courses, 3 or 4 of them by Zoom. I spoke to community groups in person, as long as they stayed in the audience and I was up on the stage. And it's been quite a while since I've presented to a faculty audience, an audience of graduate students. So this has been a real pleasure, and I really appreciate the work you put in and the kind words, clearly. Thanks.
Great. Well, all that remains before I draw this to a conclusion is to thank Linda very much for all of the work that she did to organize this event and make it possible, to thank George, and to thank Puck and John for their comments. This has been really illuminating. Thank you all.